Hi everyone, my name is Kara McIver and I am the YouTube Dietitian. I want to spend some time talking about what is important and what is not important when it comes to good health and nutrition. To me, it seems like a lot of people are getting really wrapped up in minute details rather than thinking about the broad nutrition fundamental that, frankly, Americans are really missing out on, which are leading to increased risk of chronic disease. There are a lot of people who will tell you we should be eliminating food dyes.
Goodbye, red dye number 3.
Or seed oils, or additives, preservatives to our foods. And that will make Americans healthier. I wish it was that simple, but it's not. Now, if you get through this video and you are like, I am nailing all of these things, then we will talk in future videos about some of these more niche and more in-depth topics at a more granular level. Because if you are nailing the basics, then yeah, let's talk about the more specific stuff. However, most people in this country are not nailing the basics. And there are a lot of reasons for that. I don't blame people for not nailing the basics. There are so many reasons that it is challenging to eat in the way that we as scientists or dietitians believe would reduce risk of chronic disease. There's a lot of things that make it challenging in the American way of life. So we're going to talk about that today, and hopefully you can pick up a few things that are meaningful to you that will reduce your personal risk of chronic diseases. At the beginning of 2025, it's March now, I think this happened at the end of January, the FDA, the Food and Drug Administration in the United States, which regulates our food supply and our over-the-counter and prescription drugs, ruled that one of the food dyes that is used, but it's not one of the super common food dyes, needs to be eliminated from our food system by 2027. And the reason they ruled this is because there are some studies that have shown that this food dye can cause cancer in male rats. Now, there's a ton of science that goes into this, but fundamentally, the things you need to know about red dye 3 are that they were feeding these male rats like almost 300 times the dose that a human would eat. And so at a mega dose, more than you would eat, even eating a really processed diet in our country, might cause cancer. It's also not been found to cause cancer in female rats, in other animals that have been tested, or in humans. So it's not a major cause of the increasing rates of cancer that we are seeing in the United States. There is something else that is more directly linked to the increasing rates of cancer in the United States. And that thing is overnutrition. It's that most people in this country are eating more calories than they should be eating. And unfortunately, eliminating this food dye from the small amount of foods that it is in the United States is not going to have a meaningful impact on how many calories people are eating. So while it's fine that we're going to eliminate this food dye, I don't necessarily have anything against eliminating this food dye. I just don't think it is actually going to meaningfully change the rates of cancer in this country. If we could just get people to eat the right amount of calories, then that would probably have a more meaningful impact on cancer and other chronic disease rates. I want to back up a little bit and talk about how I know that most Americans are not eating what we should be eating. Every 5 years, the federal government puts out something called the Dietary Guidelines for Americans. The Dietary Guidelines for Americans takes in all of the most updated science we have about foods, dietary patterns, specific nutrients, ways of eating that reduce our risk of developing these chronic diseases. The Dietary Guidelines for Americans also look at how much of certain nutrients we need to eliminate deficiencies. That is why the Dietary Guidelines for Americans were created, because back in the early 20th century, most Americans were dealing with undernutrition, not overnutrition. They weren't getting enough nutrients. The other part of the Dietary Guidelines for Americans is what's known as the Healthy Eating Index. The HEI is a score on how closely we are adhering to the dietary guidelines for Americans. How many servings are we getting of all the different food groups compared to how many of the servings of food groups are recommended? And then what nutrients are we getting enough of or not enough of? Overall, Americans age 2 and over, they don't even crack into the 60s. So we as a population, as a community, we are failing at meeting the dietary guidelines for Americans. So I don't think we can really say that the dietary guidelines are inappropriate. What I think we can say is we don't follow the guidelines. And if you don't follow the guidelines, you can't really say that they're not working. We have the latest nutrition science that tells us what eating patterns or what levels of consumption will reduce our risk of chronic diseases, and we are just completely ignoring those guidelines. To be more specific, I looked at the two categories that really span adulthood: the young adult age group, which is 19 to 30 in the dietary guidelines for Americans, and then 31 to 59. That is our middle-aged adults. Then there's another category of folks that are 60 plus, but we are going to talk specifically about the 19 to 30 and 31 to 59 group because this channel is really geared toward what our young and middle-aged adults can do to reduce their risk of chronic diseases. So across these two age groups, males and females are not eating enough vegetables. They are not eating enough fruit. Younger adults are not eating enough grains. None of the adult groups, 19 all the way up to 59, are specifically not eating enough whole grains. Now, those three groups are all carbohydrates: fruits, vegetables, and grains. Those are carbs. It doesn't totally surprise me that we're not eating enough carbohydrates as a population because carbohydrates have really fallen out of fashion, right? High fat diets, low carb diets, keto diets, the carnivore diet. This is what influencers talk about online as being the salvation to this chronic disease epidemic, overweight, obesity epidemic here in the United States. Now, unfortunately, that really is not the case. Fruits, vegetables, and grains are our only sources, really, of fiber. We can get fiber from maybe nuts and some plant-based proteins, but really, we get fiber from veggies, fruits, and grains. Fiber is incredibly important in reducing the risk of several chronic diseases. When we eat fiber, it slows down the carbohydrate digestion, which means our insulin levels can better match our carbohydrate intake, which can reduce our risk of type 2 diabetes. When we eat enough fiber, we also soak up the circulating cholesterol in our bloodstream, which can reduce our risk of heart diseases. And when we eat enough fiber, we keep our digestive system flowing how we want it to be, and we clean out our digestive tract. And so we reduce our risk of several types of GI cancers. And so if we're not eating enough carbohydrates, it's really difficult to be eating enough fiber. That alone would reduce chronic disease rates for many Americans. Our older adults do tend to be eating enough grains. They are in the recommended range for grains. But if you drill down a little bit farther and you look at whole grains versus refined grains, both younger and older adults are not eating enough whole grains. And whole grains specifically are how we get the fiber. Whole versus refined is really referring to if the fiber is still mostly intact. If you are in these adult age groups and you are wondering how to reduce your risk of chronic diseases, you could really start there. Ensure that you are getting enough fruits and enough vegetables, which is probably between 2 and 4 cups of both of each fruits and vegetables per day. And you're getting enough grains per day, and that half of those grains are whole grains. Both groups are not getting enough dairy. This also doesn't totally surprise me because as we age, we tend to lose the enzyme in our body that breaks down the sugar in dairy. And if you can't break down that sugar, then you tend to experience lactose intolerance, which can lead to gas, bloating, GI upset, weird poops, and we want to avoid that, right? And so we tend to avoid dairy as we get older. Dairy is really important because it contains calcium, It contains vitamin D, and it contains some protein. Calcium and vitamin D are huge for maintaining strong bones as we get older. Older adults, especially older females, have really high rates of osteoporosis, which can lead to falls and bone breaks that can be really detrimental for our older adults. Females who are going through or have already gone through menopause and older males, they just don't build strong bones in the same way. And so we need to be focusing on getting calcium, getting vitamin D when we are in our young and middle-aged adulthood, to do everything we can to set ourselves up for success, to go into older adulthood with as strong of bones as possible. If you're not doing dairy because you experience some level of lactose intolerance, then there are a couple of ways that you can avoid that while still having dairy. And that might be eating something like yogurt or cheese, which is fermented, which means some of that carbohydrate has actually already been broken down for you before you consume it. Some folks that experience some lactose intolerance actually do okay with like yogurt. And then you'll still get the calcium, you'll still get the vitamin D, but the lactose itself won't bother you as much, hopefully. You could also do something like a ultra filtered dairy product that has actually filtered out a lot of the lactose already. So you're getting the benefits of dairy again, and it's in the same form, right? Like a liquid milk, but without the lactose. And then you could also reach for things that have been fortified with calcium and vitamin D. So that might be something like a fortified orange juice drink, or even some of our plant-based milks are fortified, which means they put the calcium and they put vitamin D into them that wouldn't naturally be occurring. If none of those work for you, if you're vegan and you want to avoid all those sorts of things, then I would make sure that you are doing plenty of leafy greens in your diet. And then you might want to think about a vitamin D supplement. A lot of Americans would actually benefit from a vitamin D supplement, especially folks who live in northern states or northern parts of the US and have long periods of the year where they're just not getting as much sun and therefore are not making vitamin D through that mechanism. So those are some of the things that we're not eating enough of. Let's talk about what we're eating too much of. Across the board, young and middle-aged adults, both males and females, are eating too much sodium, too much added sugar, and too much saturated fat. These nutrients we tend to be getting too much of while we're eating too many calories, because we are getting them from these more processed foods, convenience foods, fast foods, frozen foods. If you are cooking most of your meals at home, especially when it comes to sodium, you're probably doing okay. We don't tend to oversalt at our own kitchen table or in our own kitchen. It's really these frozen foods and fast foods that tend to have really high sodium levels. If you are getting most of your meals from drive-thrus or from restaurants generally, you are probably getting too much. That can really increase your risk of high blood pressure. And over time, high blood pressure can lead to heart disease, and it can also lead to issues with your kidneys. And there really are no signs or symptoms of hypertension on its own until it really progresses into one of these other systems of your body. And then you have to make drastic changes. And so if you can make smaller changes as a younger or middle-aged adult, you will set yourself up for success as you age in reducing your risk of these cardiovascular diseases. You may be thinking,
okay, Kara, but there's no way that I can cook all or most of my meals at home. I'm too busy. I have to work 2 jobs. I have to run my 3 kids around to all their activities.
I hear you. So what I would recommend is when you go to the store, choosing frozen veggies, canned veggies, frozen meals that are specifically low in sodium. I would recommend something like going to the salad bars at a grocery store and getting more of the components and putting those together into meals, where you can look at each of the pieces of this meal, make sure that each piece is lower sodium. Maybe it's still a microwave option. You have more control over everything that's going into that, which means you can specifically make choices that are lower in sodium. Now, if you have already found that you have high blood pressure or you are approaching high blood pressure, and maybe your doctor or someone in your life has already told you that you need to reduce how much salt you're using, then I would look for non-sodium seasonings to make your food still taste good. I'm not saying you have to have boring, bland food. And another thing that has become really trendy is the hydration packets. Well, the primary electrolyte in our bodies is salt. If you are not excessively sweating, you don't need to be using these high electrolyte or high sodium beverage flavorings. They may just be contributing to your high blood pressure or your overall sodium intake during the day. Some people on the internet will tell you that maple syrup or honey or agave is healthier than white sugar. That's really not necessarily the case. They are all considered added sugars, and all of our adult age groups and sexes are eating too much added sugar. Added sugars in our food tend to make them, taste really delicious. And the more delicious something tastes, the less likely you are going to be to eat a reasonable serving size, which means things that are high in added sugar tend to be a big contributor to our overall high calorie intake, especially if you are drinking beverages that have a lot of added sugar in them. And that could be flavored coffee drinks, it could be energy drinks, it could be pop. From the Midwest, maybe you call it soda. If you are still drinking sugar sweetened beverages, probably are just bringing in sugar and calories that you don't need. There are people on the internet who are going to tell you that you absolutely can't drink diet drink. That is crazy. Don't listen to them. There is no existing research that says that 0-calorie sweeteners are going to give you cancer or going to give you any of these other chronic diseases, whereas there is plenty of research that says high amounts of added sugar from things like sugar-sweetened beverages can really increase your risk of chronic diseases. So if you are a person who is drinking regular soda or high sugary coffee, energy drink beverages, and you don't think that switching to like water, soda water, things like that is going to work for you, then you should switch to the diet or the zero sugar version of your favorite beverage. That, again, will go a long way in just reducing your overnutrition. And finally, saturated fats. Both males and females across our whole young to middle-aged adult age groups have been shown to be eating too much saturated fat. We get saturated fat mostly from animal products. So if you are eating a lot of red meat or a lot of other meat product or whole fat dairy, you are probably bringing in a lot of saturated fat. You have probably heard that claim that we should be switching from seed oils to things like beef tallow as our primary cooking oil.
It's a war between seed oil and beef tallow oil, the two recently making headlines thanks to social media wellness influencers and politicians.
All that is going to do is increase your intake of saturated fats, and we do not have any evidence that making this switch from seed oils to animal fats is going to be good for us. In fact, we have plenty of research that says seed oils are safe on their own, and when compared to high intakes of saturated fats, seed oils are going to be better for your heart health. We do tend to get seed oils from highly processed and highly packaged food. Those highly processed and highly packaged foods are really bringing us too many calories because they're specifically designed and engineered to be hard to stop eating. It's not necessarily the seed oils that are the root of all evil there. It's the fact that we are over consuming calories because we are eating these packaged foods, and this overconsumption of calories is really driving the end products that cause chronic diseases. So I would recommend cutting down on your highly processed foods in favor of things like whole fruits, whole vegetables, whole grains, but not because seed oils are the cause of chronic disease in our country. And If you are hearing advice like go carnivore, go keto, we're going to get these really high amounts of saturated fats, it can be really dangerous for our heart health, and it can be also contributing to just eating too many calories in a day. So I think that is probably enough advice for one video. To summarize, adults generally in the United States are not eating enough fruits, they're not eating enough vegetables, they're not eating enough whole grains, they're eating too many added sugars, too much sodium, and they're eating too much saturated fat. So by shifting more of what you eat to fruits, vegetables, and whole grains, keeping our protein levels at about where they are. Our protein levels, according to the Healthy Eating Index, are about right, but maybe choosing more plant-based proteins instead of animal-based proteins to reduce some of that saturated fat. Those things alone are going to go a long way in reducing your risk of chronic diseases. They're going to go a long way in reducing your insulin resistance or risk of type 2 diabetes. They're going to go a long way in reducing your blood lipids like cholesterol, your LDL, increasing your HDL. Those things that when you get a blood test at your doctor's office, if you're getting them, may be coming up as risky numbers. And then maybe cutting back on soda or switching to the diet or zero sugar versions of your favorite beverages. Those things alone are a really good place to start. Once you're nailing those, then we can talk a little bit more about some of the specific recommendations or some of these more specific to different life stages or lifestyles recommendations that there are. So come back for that next video. If you learned something or if I eased your anxiety about something, give me a thumbs up, give me a follow, and I will see you in the next one. Bye.